I know, I'm sorry. I know this is tough having a morning class, but what do you mean it's only you? Oh, got you. Okay. So is that you volunteering to go first, Ibrahim? Okay, wonderful. What group were you a part of again? Migrant workers. Okay. All right. Let me just hand off the control to you. Is anybody else helping you with the presentation, or is just you? All right, wonderful. Okay, so let me just find you on my list here. All right, you are the host now, so you can share away.
Good morning, class. I guess I'm the first to talk. Alright, so our group's topic is migrant farm workers. And our first source is the YouTube video named Temporary Foreign Workers in Canada Will Have to Leave for Years. The economic perspective of this is that the population would decrease in Canada and the overall economy would be affected since the diversity is what Canada is mainly known for. If many foreigners are sent back to their own country, it affects how diverse our country is. The impact on sustainability is the program is vital for business because finding local labor is harder than finding foreign labor because the job conditions don't appeal to many local workers. Since many people who work in factories and farms are foreign workers, the work and labor will get affected because there will not be many people left to work. Companies would have to hire more people and there would be a long process to get things back in order with new workers. Supply may be decreased for a while until new workers are found. Some questions we have is, did this program end up taking place or was the idea stopped? Were there many protests to stop this? Were there any activists as well? Which companies were most affected? What was the purpose of sending these workers back? And what was the benefit of this program? So our another source is the Canadian slave trade, temporary foreign workers. The economic perspective of this is that it lets employers find people to do undesirable jobs for cheap with quote unquote scamming them with a bad contract. It saves employers money while still getting the job done. Terminate contract of workers if asked for better benefits or question their superior. Sustainability in agriculture is getting impacted. Sorry, this is the impact on sustainability. Many workers got sent to or came to Canada for work, and they got placed in agriculture. Agriculture does not appeal to many locals. So when the workers are forced to leave the companies they employ, they lose out on hundreds of thousands of workers, making food production slower for everyone in Canada. So some questions we have for this are, what are the benefits of sending workers back? Even if there are benefits, do they outweigh the negatives? Does this affect Canadian workers in Canada? And do unemployed Canadian people lose out on jobs because of this? Sorry. And our third source, this is basically the same as the first one. Yeah. Our third source is coronavirus. Canada's migrant farm workers face fatal COVID-19 outbreaks and alleged mistreatment. So some economic perspectives on this is that there's cheap labor because majority of are Mexican immigrants desperately trying to support their family back home. Employers get to pay less as farm workers are given an insufficient amount of food and share living quarters and workspace. Some are part of the seasonal agricultural worker program, which is funded by the government, and which are temporary foreign workers that are employed during a specific time of the year, usually from May to November. That's, for example, usually when apples grow and are ready to be harvested. The impact on sustainability aspect of this is that migrant workers share living space, and workers stay in an on-site cabin with an open concept kitchen, a living room, and multiple beds spread out. So I guess they have a small footprint in Canada. And traveling from one country to another costs, however, they could also have a pretty large footprint because they have to travel from the Caribbean or Mexico to Canada. And so traveling from one country to another costs money and require fuel, and that fuel is used for airlines and other travel. So some questions we have for this is, how will the government provide compensation to the families who relied on the program to support their families? Is there a chance of policies being put in place to stop the exploitation of migrant farm workers like this in the future? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. That's great. Thank you for being the first one to go and for presenting that wonderful information. So my question, just to kind of summarize that, is what is scarce in this issue? Why is there such an issue with migrant workers?
I guess one of the issues is that, employment could be an issue, especially when you're talking about like farming, because I know a lot of people nowadays are not interested in that type of in those type of jobs. So I'd say employment for this sector could be scarce.
That's correct. Yeah, the issue is that a lot of people that live in Canada, like you said, aren't interested in working on farms, and the conditions are pretty bad. All you have to do is look back to the summertime and the outbreak of COVID in the Windsor area, and that is because of the number of migrant workers that are working on farms there. And it was so bad that the government finally stepped in and said, okay, if people do have symptoms, they have to stop working. Because at one point, workers were allowed to work even if they had a positive test, as long as they weren't showing symptoms. So it just goes to show you the issue that scarcity of employment can cause if people aren't willing to work a job that we consider to be very essential, like farm work. So thank you very, very much for that. Anybody else want to volunteer to go second? That was great, by the way. Thank you, migrant workers group. Fantastic. It's nice to hear somebody's voice for a change too. My own, to be honest. Anybody else want to go next? We got 3 other groups.
I'll go.
Okay, thanks, Drew. I'll just promote you to co-host. I promoted Ibrahim to host, and I lost the ability to do anything. So I'm just gonna promote you to co-host. Where are you? There you go. You are now a co-host. I have the same background on my desktop too.
Yeah, it's the default one.
Yeah.
Pretty good though. Alright, so our topic is about the oil sands. And stakeholders are the government of Alberta, the government of Canada, Indigenous people, oil sands companies, the Pembina, Greenpeace, the Canadian workers, and foreign workers. So the government of Alberta is affected because oil is their main industry, and that oil sands are used to make gasoline and diesel, and that Athabasca deposit is one of the largest and most developed oil sand projects in Alberta. So oil sands, they're expected to increase from 2.8 million barrels a day, which is what it is currently and in 2017, to 3.9 million barrels a day by 2027. So the government of Alberta, they're taking action to make oil sand production more clean and environmentally friendly. However, they still want to keep it going because oil is one of Canada's main natural resources. So they want to provide a platform to balance production of oil along with environmental production and economic success. So some questions we have were that if oil production is safe for the environment, and why the government of Alberta wants to use dangerous things like oil sands to make the province better. So the government of Canada also has a similar position to the government of Alberta, as they invested hundreds of millions of dollars into research for alternative energy and clean production of oil. However, they also approved the Trans Mountain project, which is like a pipeline to increase oil capacity from 300,000 barrels to 890,000 barrels a day. And the government, Canada is the 5th largest natural oil producer, and our GDP, most of it comes from oil, which is about 10%. So oil is the largest section of the GDP of Canada. So our position is that we're for the pipeline. However, we're also trying to reduce environmental damage and protect against climate change. So we have a mixed stance, but we're for the pipeline because of it's better for our economy. So some questions we had were that why the government of Canada takes conflicting actions and stances. For example, they say they support climate change, but they also support oil sands. So where does most of their effort lie, or most of their position, I guess. I don't know how to word it. And why the government of Canada is continuing to suppress opposing voices regarding major land alterations such as the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. So the Indigenous people are against oil sands because they're facing unwanted industrial projects and what they thought was their land. For example, the Alberta government doesn't consult them when making starting up projects for oil production. So they take action by organizing protests, and they have also issued multiple court cases, and they argue that a spill will be catastrophic for the communities that live in those areas and the wildlife that they rely on. So they're for preserving nature and natural resources. So some questions are that why aren't their voices being heard? And if they know the land better than anyone, why aren't they actively included? So another stakeholder would be the oil sands company. So the oil sands company therefore less regulations on oil production, and therefore the pipeline. However, they're also trying to reduce an impact on the environment and climate change. So, with the government of Canada and Alberta, they formed the COSIA, or the Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, and they want to work together with the government to reduce the impact of oil sands production. So they share their own technologies, which they invested their own resources to produce, with each other to reduce the impact on the environment. For example, they invested in a satellite known as GHG SAT to measure the impact of the work being done carried out by the oil sands. So they use the satellite to indicate if the technologies they've developed are actually efficient in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So some questions that we have is that is investing in these technologies that lower the impact of oil sands more effective than investing in alternative energies? So Pembina. So they provide informed research about the oil sands and compare them to Canada's goals. They urge both oil companies and the government to work together towards a better future. Gives a recommendation based on the research. They urge for more regulation to decarbonize, appoint credible energy regulators, and define and enforce emission targets for 2030. So they acknowledge the great benefits of oil sands. They're trying to find a middle ground between both sides to make a smoother transition into cleaner energy. So some questions that we had was that how will we continue to push governments and oil companies towards a more renewable future? So Greenpeace, so they're rising against the expansion of oil sands and in support of the transition to clean energy. So they're against the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline tech and other projects that expand tar sands. And this movement is led by indigenous communities whose land is being taken away for these projects. So they're against oil sands, and they do this because they have this viewpoint because they think that oil sands bring damage to the boreal forest and endanger wildlife, which would infringe on their indigenous rights. So some questions that we had is if clean energy is as effective as oil sands, if not, who should pay for the project? Should Greenpeace pay or the government of Canada? So the Canadian workers, they're for the pipeline and they're for less regulation on oil sands because their jobs are at risk if oil prices are decreasing and oil production is going down and we're moving into cleaner energy. And if so the number of jobs that can decrease, they can decrease by about 25% if the price of oil does not recover. And most of the Canadian workers fly from other provinces like Ontario, Quebec, etc., to Alberta and the remote oil sites. Therefore, oil sands because they make good money. As an oil worker, you have a fairly high compensation. So we believe some questions that we had is that do the workers believe that the price of oil sands will be able to go back to normal? And what will these workers do if they get laid off due to low oil prices? And the last stakeholder would be foreign workers. Foreign workers, like oil sands, also provide foreign workers job opportunities. And although these jobs may be temporary, they provide bonuses that are fairly high, and they can apply to Canada, apply for visas to work in Canada and elevate the economy. And those in America can boost their small towns' value. Therefore, oil sands and for making a profit. And some questions that we had were that do they believe the sacrifice of leaving, if it is worth it? And what do these opportunities mean to them? Thank you.
Great, that's fantastic. Very very in depth. Thank you, Oil Sands Tar Sands Group. That was really good. So lots of stakeholders, and you'll find that there's a lot of overlap between this and your culminating. So I'm glad that this group was able to kind of summarize the key stakeholders, because you'll find a lot of them are going to be very similar to the stakeholders in the Keystone pipeline issue as well. So the overall question I'm going to ask this group is, what is scarce in this issue? What is the scarcity that's going on here that's caused these number of stakeholders to have different, not varieties, but different levels of concern?
Like the healthiness of the environment, because
Okay.
like the main concern is the damage to the environment and the land.
So the scarcity then would be the land, right?
Yeah.
Good. And that's the trick, right? Because you've got to try to balance. And this is where I find it really interesting that you mentioned the federal government and trying to balance the interests of Alberta and of the economy with that of the environment. It's like they're being duplicitous in that sense, where they are they're for climate protection, saving the environment, but yet they're supporting pipelines. And that is on purpose, because if they look like they are against oil sands, then Alberta turns against Canada even more than they already are, and they don't get support out west. But on the same hand, other side, if they look like they're for oil sands and so-called destruction of the environment, then they lose a lot of support that way. So it's tricky because you've got to balance the two, and that's why I think including Pembina is a good choice, because it's they try to provide a balanced viewpoint. Now, my one other question is, and this is for the entire class, why do you think the voices of Indigenous peoples aren't heard in these matters?
Would it be because like the big companies that produce oil bring in more revenue for the government, like taxes and stuff?
That's part of it, yep. So to the federal government, what's more important, the voices of the Indigenous people or profit?
Money, profit.
Exactly. And it speaks to the structural issues of anti-Indigenous racism in Canada, that traditionally these are Indigenous territories. And the fact that that they're not being listened to is extremely concerning, because ultimately it comes down to, right, their ways of life don't give the government money. And interestingly enough, when we talk about the Keystone Pipeline, there are groups of Indigenous peoples that actually were willing to and looking to invest in the pipeline. So there's also that contradiction of interests from Indigenous groups as well, because yeah, it's a lot of money, and to say no to a lot of money is a tough decision to make. The opportunity cost is very difficult. So that the whole issue of climate change and oil, and I'm glad that you mentioned the importance of oil in the Canadian economy, because it provides a lot of money for the federal government, provincial governments. So it's a really tough choice. Okay, we've got two more to go through. Who wants to go next? We've got banks versus co-ops / credit unions, and we've got, what was the last one? Land claims, interestingly enough. Thank you, Drew and group, for that. That was fantastic. Who wants to go next? Anybody going once, going twice? Should we do random number? Okay, thank you, Ayman and Hannah. So the two of you are presenting, Ayman and Hannah. And Jeff? Okay, so let me just start promoting some people and demoting Drew. Sorry, Drew. So Hannah and Jeff. If I knew my alphabet, I'd be okay. All right, so I think I've got everybody as co-host now.
Can we start?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So co-ops, a cooperative is a legally incorporated corporation that is owned by its members who use cooperative services to purchase their products. They are democratic leaders, so all members have an equal say in what the business does, and not all cooperatives are for profit.
They follow the not-for-profit business model, which means profits are either reinvested back into the business, issued as dividends to members, or donated to local charities and community programs.
Profits are distributed to members based on the amount of business they do in the cooperative. Shares are entitled to their share to a portion of corporate profits. They are then distributed by the company in the form of stock dividends.
So banks offer deposit accounts that are secure places for people to keep their money. Banks use the money in deposit accounts to make loans to other people or businesses. In return, the bank receives interest payments on those loans from